Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm popping on with an extra video this week because I wanted to share the books that I've been reading over the past week. It's been a busy one, but I still managed to read 4 books and I'm really eager to tell you about them. So to begin with, I managed to read 2 books that are part of the British Library Women Writers series this week. I know many of you are interested in this series. It's all about rediscovering forgotten classics of the early 20th century by women writers. And I've been really enjoying a lot of the books in this series, and one I've been very much looking forward to reading is Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. And it didn't disappoint. I was really glad that I enjoyed it so much. I couldn't believe the publication date of this book, actually. It was originally published in 1915, and I found that quite astonishing with some of the subject matter that this book deals with. It really feels quite a modern read in many ways, and it was definitely ahead of its time. And I'm so glad that it's been republished because I think it is so worthy of a read now. Sally on the Rocks is about a young woman called Sally. She's been living in Paris just before the outbreak of World War I. She started to feel rather jaded over life. She had an unhappy love affair when she was younger, and she's now decided that she needs to settle down and try to fall in love with a rich man, as she herself is penniless, but she does enjoy life's comforts. And rather than going to the bad, so to speak, she figures she should marry sensibly. Her decision to return home to England is prompted first by the outbreak of war, but then she receives a letter from a Miss Maggie who is living in Little Crampton, which is where Sally's guardian, the vicar, lives as well. Miss Maggie is the sort of character that you love to hate. She's a sort of evil Miss Marple type person, and she's the sort of typical old maid spinster who is a real gossip and finds out everybody's business. But where Miss Marple is lovable, Miss Maggie is hateful. She reminds me of Miss Marple because she has an incredible nose for any kind of mystery. She can ferret out anybody's skeletons in their closet. She suspects that one of her neighbours is poisoning his wives. He's already got rid of one wife, and the new wife, keeps getting ill. So Miss Maggie is suspicious. But she really is quite a horrible character. And she's decided that the village life is getting a bit dull, and how much more fun it would be if she could tempt Sally back and play her off against another woman, a widow, Mrs. Dalton, who is interested in the eligible bachelor of the village, a Mr. Bingley. Miss Maggie thinks that Mr. Bingley might prove a good husband for Sally, and how fun would it be to watch Mrs. Dalton and Sally play each other off as rivals for Mr. Bingley, the bank manager. Anyway, Sally is intrigued by this letter and the prospect of a wealthy bachelor for herself, so she decides to go back to Little Crampton. What I love about this book is that Sally and Mrs. Dalton are not daggers drawn rivals. In fact, when they meet each other, although they know they're both after the same prize, they actually like each other very much. They also both realise that they're after Mr. Bingley because they can't really think of any alternative. They know he's not the most attractive would-be husband, and they wish each other really the very best. There's a lot of comedy in this book. There's so many entertaining descriptions of Mr. Bingley himself, who is an incredibly conceited, rather portly, pedantic, pompous, really awful man. But he has a very high opinion of himself. I think he's very amusingly named. Mr. Bingley, of course, makes me think of Pride and Prejudice, but sadly, this Mr. Bingley is definitely not the Mr. Bingley in Jane Austen land. Now, of course, thinking of Pride and Prejudice makes you think of Mrs. Bennet and her desire for her daughters to marry well, but this feels a lot more like reality in that the Mr. Bingley in this book is not dashing and young and charming. He is rather middle-aged, pompous, and prejudiced. However, Sally's determined to just grin and bear it and to get Mr. Bingley if she can. However, I think the reader never really thinks it likely that Sally is going to pull it off because she just can't help being herself around Mr. Bingley. To do him some credit though, he does end up falling in love for Sally, and it is in fact love that redeems both Sally and Mr. Bingley in the end. You end up having more sympathy than you ever thought possible for Mr. Bingley because he does have real feelings in the end for Sally, but you can still only really pity whoever his wife is going to be. Now, things for Sally become complicated when she meets an ex-soldier, and she meets him in very dramatic circumstances. She, in fact, prevents him from committing suicide. She feels drawn to this man, but she doesn't know what his future will really hold, and she's determined to stick to her plan of Mr. Bingley. However, then her old flame from her past suddenly materializes as well in Little Crampton. He is now very happily married, but seeing him again reminds Sally of how much pain love can bring her, and she is more and more determined to go after Mr. Bingley. But Miss Maggie senses that there is more to Sally's past than meets the eye, and she's determined to find out what skeleton is in Sally's cupboard, even if it means ruining Sally completely. So there is a lot at play in this book, but I really recommend it. It was such a good read. There's a lot of darker undercurrents to the surface story, not only about what women's position and what their limited choices were in those days, but the book does also touch on the start of war, and it overshadows so much of the story. But there are, like I said, also a lot of funny scenes in this book, and like I said, love in the end plays a very redeeming part to this story, and Sally has her happy ending. So it is a satisfying read as well, and yes, one that I recommend. And then I was sent this one very kindly by the publisher, and that's Which Way by Theodora Benson, another of the British Library Women Writers series. This one had a really interesting premise. If you've seen the film Sliding Doors by Gwyneth Paltrow, starring Gwyneth Paltrow, then this will sound familiar, because the idea is that the young woman in this book ends up living out her life in 3 different ways. There comes this pivotal moment in her story where she receives 3 different invitations, and you see what happens to her future when she accepts each different invitation, and her life stretches out in 3 different alternative pathways. So the premise is very, very interesting. There's quite a bit of background first to, I think it's Claudia. Yes, Claudia Heseltine is the heroine in this story. And there's a bit of background first. So in some ways, this is an unusual type of coming of age story. You see how Claudia grows up, and then the 3 different paths her life can take as she decides ultimately between 3 different men. and 3 different ways of living her life, although each of those ways does revolve in some way around a man. In one, she becomes a mistress. In another, she has a child and is a devoted mother. And in a third, she's very much a want-to-be mistress, shall we say. She falls in love with a married man, but he in the end does not reciprocate those feelings. This is such an interesting book because I think we've all had those what if moments. What if I'd done this in my life instead of that? What if I'd taken this path instead of another one? And what this book shows is whatever path you take, sometimes people who are meant to be in your life will still come up and be a part of your life, even if in different ways, different forms. And I thought that was a really interesting idea that Theodora Benson explores in this book. She also shows how choices you make may end up affecting your character as well, and your beliefs to a certain extent. This book really shows both how Claudia stays the same in her different alternative lives, but also the ways in which she changes and the ways in which she adapts to the people around her. It's interesting because not only does Theodora Benson explore the different men in Claudia's life and her different futures with them, the early part of the book really focuses on her friendship with a female friend, her best friend. And that friendship takes very different courses as well through the 3 different paths of her life. Anyway, like I said, I really enjoyed the premise of this book, and I really liked the execution as well. It gives you a lot to think about, and although it is very much a book of its time and it reflects the choices that women had in that time, it also makes you think of choices that you can make now. But it also, I think, helps anyone who maybe might have any regrets or any of those what if moments. It does also help you think that whatever path your life will take you on, ultimately that will be the right path for you, and the people who are meant to be in your life will still be in it one way or another. So this was another one that I found really interesting and enjoyed. And then another book I read this week is Consequences by E.M. Delafield. If you watched last week's video on my recent reads, then you'll know that I read 3 other novels by E.M. Delafield the week before, and then this week I read Consequences. I'm reading a lot of E.M. Delafield at the moment because Diary of a Provincial Lady by her is our comfort book club choice for November, and my mum and I will be discussing the Diary of a Provincial Lady this coming Friday, so I think that's the 26th of November. But this month I've been enjoying reading a lot of other novels by E.M. Delafield. I have to say the Consequences could not be more different from Diary of a Provincial Lady, which really is one of my favourite comfort reads. It's so light-hearted, so witty and funny. And Consequences is one of the saddest books I've ever read, I think. It's very bleak. It really is just one bad thing after another for the luckless heroine Alex, and the book also ends in a suicide. So I really cried at the end of this one, and it was a tough read in that way. It is amazingly written. I mean, I think E.M. Delafield is such a brilliant writer, and she just brings to life the upper class society of the late Victorian era so well. I mean, she very much knew that society herself, and she really brings it alive, especially in the dialogue. She had such an ear, such a knack for dialogue, and the little domestic details as to the way that servants were addressed or how households were run, and the attention to sort of clothing, all the detail around what characters wear that she gives is really fascinating. But anyway, like I said, this book is about a woman called Alex, and Consequences takes her from playing the paper game of Consequences in the nursery all through her life to adulthood. And you see how certain seemingly quite small, some are more significant, but how certain events in her life have terrible consequences on the rest of her life. Alex is a character who is simply desperate for love all of her life. She wants so much to love and to be loved herself. And the real tragedy of her life is that she never is loved, really. I think E.M. Delafield drew on some of her own unhappy childhood and sort of young adulthood in writing this. Alex in this book has a disastrous coming out into society. Her parents expect her to make a good match, and she doesn't. She does become engaged at one point, but she is honest with herself and realizes that she and her fiancé are not in love with each other at all. And she makes a brave decision to end the engagement, much to the disappointment and anger of her parents. And in these days, it was shown how clear it was that women were simply expected to marry well, and that was it. And if they didn't, then they were considered real failures. Alex is certainly taught to feel a failure. She doesn't know what to do with her life. She desperately craves love and to be able to love someone, but no one seems to come her way. She ends up taking the decision to become a nun. E.M. Delafield herself entered a nunnery at one point in her life, and the picture she draws of living the life of a nun is really quite harrowing. Alex goes to a convent in Belgium, and after 10 years decides that this life isn't for her. And the struggle she has in getting away from the convent, in revoking her vows, and then in finally coming back home to England, and how strange it feels to her to meet some of her family again after 10 years, to be in the world again, in London again after 10 years. Suddenly telephones exist, there's suddenly the London Underground, and all of these things that she simply didn't know were happening in the world. And E.M. Delafield captures that confusion just so well. It's very moving and very powerful in the book. But like I said, ultimately, Alex is just desperate for a love that she can't seem to find. And it really is a very sad, heart-wrenching book. But I still was glad to read it, and I know it will be a book that will stay with me for sure. And after reading that, I felt in the mood for something a bit more light-hearted. So I picked up A Snowfall of Silver by Laura Wood, which is a YA novel. I've spoken before on this channel about Laura Wood's YA books. I've enjoyed quite a few of them. I've read both A Sky Painted Gold, which is set in Cornwall in the 1920s, and then Under a Dancing Star, which is set in Italy in the 1930s. This one, A Snowfall of Silver, is in some ways a bit of a sequel to, I always forget the name of the first one, A Sky Painted Gold. It's a bit of a sequel to A Sky Painted Gold because it's about Lou, who is the heroine in A Sky Painted Gold. This is about Lou's sister Freya and her dreams of becoming an actress. And in this book, Freya runs away from Cornwall to London to go and stay with her sister Lou, who is now making it as a writer in the city. And she decides to become an actress. Now, it's a lot easier said than done. When she gets to London, Freya realizes that she needs to try to get a job. And by sheer good fortune, she meets a young man on the train on the way to London, and he ends up working for a theatre. So Freya goes along and asks if he can help her in any way, and he manages to get her a job as the sort of wardrobe assistant in the theatre. Freya has a real talent with a needle. She loves creating costumes for the theatre. So it's a sort of perfect job for her while she tries to learn a bit more about acting and become a better actress herself. This theatre company ends up going on tour, and there are some lovely descriptions of London to begin with, and then Oxford, and then travelling around the north of England. This starts in November, and there are some lovely autumnal scenes in London and Oxford. Then it goes into December, and you get some really lovely wintry, snowy scenes. There's a particularly memorable passage that I really enjoyed in this book when the theatre company travelled to a lovely tiny little Georgian playhouse in Yorkshire, and this was actually based on a real playhouse, a real Georgian playhouse that is in Richmond in Yorkshire, and it makes me really want to go and see it sometime because Laura Wood describes this little theatre just so perfectly. It sounds beautiful. And the company end up getting snowbound there, and they can't put on any performances, but instead they have a magnificent feast in the theatre, and they end up having to sleep in the theatre. But there's some just lovely wintry, snowy scenes, and of course there's a bit of a love story going on as well, and it's just quite a sort of cozy read. And Freya discovers that maybe being an actress wasn't everything she thought it would be, but she discovers a path that is really right for her and that still keeps her in the world of the theatre. So there's a lovely ending to this story too, and it ends right at sort of Christmas time. So it's actually a perfect read for right now because it starts in November but takes you right up to Christmas. So this put me in a really festive mood, which was lovely. And if you are in the mood for a bit of a light but sort of fun read and a book that's set in the interwar years, which is always a favourite period of mine, then you might like to pick this up as well. I think it's a really sweet read for adults as well as being a good YA novel. The only thing I will say about it is that the sort of language used and all of the sort of characters is very modern in feeling. I think that I love the way that Laura Wood does set her books in the interwar years, but there isn't always as much of a flavour of the time period as you might get from maybe adult novels more. I think especially in terms of the language, she doesn't really capture the feeling of that time. So that's a kind of one con I would say to this, but I do like that so many of her books have a bit of a literary element to them. For this book, for instance, the play that the theatre company is touring with is The Importance of Being Earnest, and there are a lot of allusions to the play, and it's one of my very favourite Oscar Wilde plays, so that's a really fun touch to this story. And likewise, the one set in Italy, Under a Dancing Star, is partly based on Much Ado About Nothing. And then A Sky Painted Gold is very much inspired by The Great Gatsby in terms of the decadent parties that she describes. So I do like that there's a bit of a literary element to her books in that way as well. Anyway, those are the books that I've read this week. Do let me know if you've read any of these, what you thought about them, or if you're keen to read any. I would love to know. But thanks so much for watching. Do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and you can subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face that pops up on the screen over here. But I'll be back again very soon. It should be Tuesday, and with that video I'll be doing my very big Christmas book gift guide. So I'll hope to see you again then. Goodbye.